Hey guys, tonight we are going back to ancient Rome, to a city that gave the world aqueducts, concrete and written law, and a great many everyday habits that would stop a modern visitor in their tracks. Before we set off, one small and entirely optional thing. If these long, slow wanders through history are the sort of company you like, a like or a subscribe helps this little channel more than you would expect, and only if you genuinely enjoy what happens here. And if you feel like leaving a comment, tell me which corner of the world you are listening from and what the clock happens to say where you are. I find it lovely knowing how many different hours these old stories drift through. Now, let us go and stand in a Roman street. It is the 2nd century of the empire, and Rome is the largest city on earth. Something close to 1 million people are packed inside its walls, a number no other European city would reach again for well over 1,000 years. The streets are narrow and paved with heavy basalt blocks worn into ruts by cartwheels. Apartment blocks rise 4, 5, sometimes 6 stories on either side, so the sunlight comes down in a narrow band and most of the road stays in blue shadow until midday. There is noise everywhere. Iron-rimmed wheels rattling over stone, a coppersmith tapping, someone calling out a price, and beneath all of it the low steady murmur of a great many people who all need to be somewhere. Running underneath even that, so ordinary that nobody remarks on it, is the sound of water. Rome ran on water. 9 aqueducts, and in time 11, brought it down from the hills in long stone channels, and once it was inside the city, it never really stopped moving. It fed the fountains at the street corners, it fed the baths, and when it had finished with everything else, it was let loose through the drains beneath the pavement and carried out to the Tiber. Which brings us, gently, to the first thing that would surprise you. Roman public conveniences, the latrinae, were rooms you walked into straight off the street, and they were not private. Picture a fairly handsome chamber, sometimes with a mosaic floor and a small fountain playing in the middle, and running around the walls a long bench of stone with evenly spaced openings cut into it. No partitions, no doors, no polite pretense of separation at all. Beneath the bench ran a channel of that endlessly moving water, which carried everything away into the great sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, already centuries old by then, and, remarkably, still doing part of its job today. The engineering was genuinely first-rate. The seating arrangement from where we sit is another matter. You simply went in, found a free place, sat down beside whoever was already there, and carried on with your day. Your neighbour might be a baker, or a soldier back from the Danube, or a man in the middle of a firm opinion about the price of grain, which he would very likely share with you. These rooms were social. People talked, traded gossip, complained about the games and arranged to meet later. A conversation held in a Roman public convenience was simply a conversation, in a room that happened to be one. Some of these chambers were decorated with a painted image of Fortuna, the goddess of luck, which suggests a certain sense of humour about it all. As for cleaning up, they had no paper. What they used was the tersorium, a sea sponge fixed to the end of a short stick, rinsed in a shallow gutter of running water that ran along the floor in front of the seats, sometimes freshened with vinegar, and then left there for the next person. That is the whole of it, and we will leave it there. To a Roman it was simply practical, but it tells us something real and worth carrying with us, because it explains a good deal of what follows. The Romans drew the line between public and private in a completely different place than we do. Bathing, exercising, arguing about politics, eating, mourning, celebrating, and, yes, this, were all things done in company. Solitude was not especially prized. A Roman would have found our habit of doing almost everything alone, behind a closed door, rather sad. Now, back out into the street and let us talk about laundry, because the Romans were very particular about clean clothes and had an unusual way of getting them. Roman clothing was mostly wool, and wool in a hot, dusty, crowded city does not stay fresh for long. So every town of any size had its fulleries, the Phalonicae, which were part laundry and part finishing works for new cloth straight off the loom. Pompeii alone had more than a dozen, and we can still walk through one of them, the great fullery of Veranius Hypsius, whose owners were proud enough of the trade to have the whole process painted on the walls for visitors to admire. The cleaning agent was ammonia, and the cheapest source of ammonia in the ancient world was stale urine. There is real chemistry behind it. Ammonia is alkaline. It cuts through the natural grease in wool and lifts the dirt out of the fibres. Jars were set out at street corners to collect it, and the contents carted round to the workshops. That is the practical fact, and we can move straight on to what happened inside the workshop, which is by far the more interesting part. The garments went into a row of waist-high stone tubs, and a worker climbed into each one and trod the cloth underfoot, holding a rail or bracing his hands against the walls to keep his balance, shifting his weight from foot to foot for a long stretch of time. The Romans had a name for the motion. They called it the fuller's dance. Then came rinsing in tub after tub of clean water, and after that the finishing, which is where the trade really earned its money. The damp cloth was brushed and teased with dried thistle heads, or sometimes with a hedgehog skin, to raise a soft nap on the surface. Then it was stretched over a dome-shaped wicker frame and set above a dish of smouldering sulphur, so the fumes could bleach it pale. Then it was rubbed with a fine white clay, the creta phallonica, to lift the colour further and give the fabric body. And finally it went into a great wooden screw press and came out flat and bright and smooth. The result was a tunic whiter and crisper than anything you could manage at home, which is why people paid for it. The trade was profitable enough to become a matter of state. The Emperor Vespasian, who was rebuilding the empire's finances after a ruinous civil war, and taxed a great many unlikely things along the way, put a levy on the collection from those street corner jars. It is said that his son Titus objected to the indignity of the idea, and that Vespasian held up a coin and asked him whether it offended him. Given the sponge and the fullery, you might reasonably conclude that the Romans were careless about cleanliness. They were the exact opposite. As a culture, they were quietly obsessed with washing. Nearly every Roman city of any consequence had public baths, and the great imperial ones in the capital were not modest neighbourhood establishments. They were among the largest roofed buildings anyone had yet attempted. Inside there were gardens and running tracks, 2 libraries, 1 Greek and 1 Latin, lecture rooms, shops, masseurs, barbers, a great open-air swimming pool, and vaulted halls faced in coloured marble with windows of glass set high in the walls, so the light came down through the steam in long. The baths of Caracalla covered something like 25 acres and could take thousands of visitors in a single day. The baths of Diocletian were larger still, and the central hall of that complex survives today as a church, which gives some sense of the scale. The routine had a shape to it, and Romans followed it the way we follow a familiar recipe. Most people went in the afternoon, once the day's business was finished. You began in the palestra, the exercise yard, where people threw a ball about, wrestled or lifted weights, mostly for the pleasure of working up a little heat. Then you moved inward through the rooms in order of temperature. First, the tepidarium, gently warm, to let the body settle. Then the caldarium, properly hot, with its steaming basin and a floor so warm that bathers crossed it in wooden-soled sandals. And finally the frigidarium and the cold plunge, which snapped everything back into place and sent you out into the evening feeling entirely new. It was regarded as a matter of health rather than luxury, and it was extraordinarily cheap. Entry cost a quadrans, the smallest coin in circulation, which meant that almost anyone could go. Seneca, who once had lodgings above a bathhouse, left a wonderfully weary account of the noise coming up through his floor, the grunting of the men with the weights, the slap of the masseurs' hands, the ball players counting their throws aloud, and worst of all, he says, the man who insisted on. The poet Martial grumbles about the bell that rang across the neighbourhood to announce that the water was hot, and about friends who lingered in there so long that dinner went cold waiting for them, singing in the pool. There was no soap as we would know it. Instead you were rubbed with olive oil, which loosened the dirt and the sweat, and an attendant scraped the whole lot away with a strigil, a curved blade of bronze-shaped, rather like a shallow spoon drawn out long. It sounds unpromising, and it worked perfectly well. Bathers carried their oil in a small round flask with the strigil hung on a ring beside it, and the two are often found buried together, a Roman gym bag 2,000 years old. Clothes were left in the changing room, and the gathering was communal in the fullest sense. Senators, freedmen, soldiers, merchants and philosophers all used the same rooms on the same afternoon, and nobody found it worth remarking on. Business was conducted there. Deals were struck, lawsuits rehearsed, poems recited at people who had not asked to hear them. It was gymnasium, spa, club, and public square all at once. And underneath the floor, entirely invisible, sat the cleverest part of all. The hypocaust was a forest of short brick pillars, holding the floor up off the ground, with hot air from a furnace circulating between them and then rising through hollow tiles built into the walls, so that the whole room glowed like an enormous ceramic stove. Enslaved workers fed those furnaces day and night in passages below where none of the bathers ever went, and it is worth pausing on that. The comfort of the baths, like a great deal else in Roman life, rested on the labour of people who had no say in the matter at all. Which brings us to dinner, and to another Roman habit that looks decidedly odd from a chair. Wealthy Romans did not sit down to eat. They reclined. The formal dining room was called the triclinium, named for the 3 couches arranged around 3 sides of a low table, with the 4th side left open so that servants could come and go. 9 was the ideal number of guests, 3 to a couch, and every place on those couches carried a rank, so where you were put told you, and everybody else, exactly what your host thought of you. You lay on your left side, propped on your elbow with a cushion beneath it, and ate with your right hand. Whole evenings passed like that. The posture was the entire point. To recline was to announce that you had time, and standing, and other people to carry things to you. Then the main courses, roast meats and fish and vegetables, sauces sharpened with herbs and vinegar and honey, and almost always a spoonful of garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans added to very nearly everything, shipped in sealed jars from the coast of Spain and from the workshops along the. Sitting upright at a table was what workers did, and servants, and children, until they were considered old enough to be trusted horizontal. The meal arrived in movements. First the gestatio, the opening, with eggs, olives, shellfish and salad leaves. Then the second table, the sweet one, with fruit, nuts and honey cakes. Wine went round all evening, though nearly always cut with water, since drinking it neat was thought the mark of a barbarian. The diluted version still did its slow work across 4 or 5 hours. Musicians played. Poetry was read aloud. Somebody always talked politics. It could be very elegant indeed. One fashionable floor design of the age was a mosaic known as the unswept room, which depicted, in careful coloured stone, the fish bones and fruit skins and scattered nutshells that a generous dinner had left behind, so that the evidence of hospitality was permanently celebrated underfoot. A joke and a boast at the same time, which is a very Roman thing to be. And speaking of what the Romans left on their walls, we tend to picture the ancient city as white marble and clean lines, sunlit and serene. The reality was much closer to a modern town, and that includes the writing. Walk through the excavated streets of Pompeii today, and you find thousands of scratched and painted inscriptions across house fronts, shop fronts, tavern walls and public buildings. Election notices, painted up in neat red letters by professional sign writers working through the night, urging you to vote for this or that candidate for local office, sometimes with an endorsement from the fruit sellers or the mule drivers attached. Announcements of gladiator shows, with the date and the welcome promise of awnings against the sun. Praise for particular fighters. And in among all of it, ordinary people simply being people. Marcus loves Julia. Someone was here. A complaint about an innkeeper who watered his wine. One much-quoted line runs roughly along these lines. I am amazed, Wall, that you have not collapsed under the weight of all this nonsense. 2,000 years ago, somebody was already tired of graffiti. It tells us something quietly important as well, which is that a good many ordinary Romans could read and write at least a little. The walls were a running conversation carried on in plaster, in a city where everybody passed, everybody else on the way to the fountain. Taverns collected their own share, the ancient equivalent of a review left where the owner could not easily remove it, and rather less forgiving than a modern star rating, since it was cut permanently into his wall. What strikes you, reading them, is how little the tone has changed. Empires rise, provinces are won and lost, whole languages fall out of use, and still the reliable constant is that if you leave a human being alone with a blank wall, something will end up written on it. And after all that walking and reading and arguing, you would want feeding. Here, Rome starts to feel startlingly familiar. Most people lived in the insulae, the tall apartment blocks, and a great many of those flats had no kitchen at all. An open fire in a crowded timber-floored building was an obvious hazard, and space was short in any case. So, Romans ate out constantly from small counters set into the street front called thermopolia. And that is exactly where we are going next. These counters were, in every practical sense, the fast food of the ancient world. Picture a broad slab of stone facing straight onto the street, worn smooth by years of elbows and small coins, with a row of round openings set into it, each one holding a deep clay jar sunk down like a little well. Inside those jars waited the food of the day, thick stews. Lentils softened with herbs, beans cooked down until a spoon would stand upright in them, pieces of meat in sauce, vegetables simmering slowly, and sometimes wine or a warm spiced drink for a cold morning. You walked up, you pointed, you paid a few coins, and then either ate standing at the counter or carried the meal away with you. Quick, cheap, and requiring no preparation at all. If that arrangement sounds suspiciously like buying lunch at a takeaway window today, that is because it very nearly was, arrived 2,000 years earlier by people who would be quietly baffled by our surprise. The buried streets of Pompeii have preserved these places better than anywhere else. Archaeologists have identified more than 80 food counters scattered across the town, a remarkable number for a city of that size, and a fairly strong hint that eating out was not an occasional treat, but simply how a great many people got through the day. Some counters still carry their painted decoration, bright panels showing jars and dishes, birds and fish, and the gods thought to look kindly on trade. The Romans had already worked out that a picture of the food helps to sell the food. Ancient advertising, in mineral pigment, still legible 2,000 years later. The people who relied on them were the city's ordinary working population. Porters and weavers, dockhands and shopkeepers, travellers newly through the gate who did not know a soul, and above all the great number of people who lived in apartment blocks. Roman apartment buildings, the insulae, often had no kitchen at all above the ground floor. An open flame in a stacked building of timber and brick was a genuine terror in a city that burned with some regularity, so the higher you lived, the less you cooked. If you cannot cook at home, you buy from the street. The atmosphere must have been busy and companionable. Bread came from the bakery on the corner, still warm, the smell of it drifting the whole length of the block in the early morning. Sellers called out what they had. Regulars leaned on the counter and traded the news. Somewhere a mule cart scraped past. A shutter banged open. A child ran an errand badly and was sent back to do it again. And exactly as happens today, you almost certainly knew which counter did the best lentils and which one you walked past unless you were feeling adventurous. Roman writers of the more respectable sort looked down on these places, which tells us mostly that respectable writers rarely queued at them. None of it was elegant, and none of it was meant to be. It bore no resemblance to the long reclining dinners of the wealthy, with their courses and couches and careful seating. This was practical food for people who had somewhere to be. Long before anyone dreamed up a drive-through window, Rome had already invented dinner on the move. Walk on from that counter, though, and linger in the street a little longer, and something else begins to catch the eye. The Romans were, by any reasonable measure, gambling more or less constantly. Dice games ran through every level of society, top to bottom, with an enthusiasm that no law ever managed to dent. Soldiers played on campaign, on whatever flat surface the camp could offer. Merchants played while waiting for a late shipment. Labourers played at the end of a shift. Senators played too, though they generally preferred to describe it as a dignified pastime among friends, which it very often was not. Roman dice, the tesserae, would sit familiarly in your hand today. Small cubes marked 1 to 6, the opposite faces adding up to 7, thrown onto a board or a tabletop. There was also an older game played with knuckle bones, 4-sided and irregular, which fell in less predictable ways. The very best result had the name of a goddess attached to it. The worst was known simply as the dogs. The stakes ranged from trivial to alarming. Sometimes a few coins moved back and forth across an afternoon and nothing was lost that mattered. Sometimes a ring went onto the table, or a good cloak, or a piece of land, and the mood in the room shifted with the sound of the throw. Officially, all of this was restricted. Roman law took a dim view of betting for money outside certain festival periods, and there were penalties on the books for anyone running a gaming house. Enforcement, however, was as flexible as it usually is when a law forbids something that nearly everybody enjoys. The evidence of that is still there in the stone. Archaeologists have found gainboards scratched directly into the steps of public buildings, into benches, into the paving of colonnades and shop thresholds. Someone, 2,000 years ago, looked at a beautifully cut marble step and decided it would make an excellent surface on which to lose a week of wages. Taverns were the natural home of the habit. Small, crowded, warm rooms where the wine was poured freely and the noise carried out into the street. Dice clattering on wood, someone insisting that a throw had been unfair, someone else laughing far too loudly at their own good luck. Occasionally the authorities made an effort, closed a room, fined a landlord, and then rather visibly lost interest. During the winter festival of Saturnalia, when ordinary rules loosened for a stretch of days and the whole city gave itself over to feasting and gift-giving, gambling became openly permitted, and Rome played with a kind of licensed abandon. When the festival ended, the dice did not. Roman moralists complained about all of it at length, as moralists will. They wrote about men who could not stop, who lost fortunes throw by throw and left their families poorer for it. The equipment has changed since, the pull has not. The Romans understood that small suspended moment between the throw and the result perfectly well, and they were more than willing to pay for it. Here is another Roman habit that would cause quiet chaos in a modern family: naming children. Today we try to give each child something of their own, partly for identity, partly for paperwork, and partly so that calling a name across a room does not summon 4 people at once. Rome took the opposite approach, with remarkable consistency. In many families, sons were given the same name as their fathers, and their sons were given it again, generation after generation, until the family tree read rather like a stutter. A citizen man usually carried 3 names, an arrangement known as the tria nomina. There was a personal name, then a clan name marking the wider family, and then a third name that identified a particular branch of it. The trouble sits in that first personal name, because the pool of options was astonishingly small. Marcus, Gaius, Lucius, Publius, Quintus, Titus, Aulus, and a handful of others accounted for the overwhelming majority of Roman men. So few were in circulation that inscriptions routinely shortened them to a single letter, and every reader knew which name each letter meant. If a father was Marcus, his eldest son had a very good chance of being Marcus as well. So a household could easily contain several people answering to the same word. Marcus the father, Marcus the son, an uncle, Marcus a cousin, Marcus arriving for the holidays. Family softened this a little with the third name, which often began life as an affectionate or an unkind nickname before hardening into an inherited title. These names might refer to a temperament, an achievement, an ancestral farm, or some feature of a long-dead ancestor's face, and a striking number of proud old families were walking about with a surname that had originally meant bald, or flat-footed, or chickpea. Once a nickname stuck, it belonged to the whole line, which is why the same distinctive name can turn up across centuries. Daughters were handled more economically still. A girl was usually named straight from her father's family name, given a feminine ending, and the matter was considered settled. If the family was Julius, the daughter was Julia. If there were 2 daughters, they might be distinguished simply as the elder and the younger. If there were more, some families numbered them, so that a household could contain a 3rd and a 4th, women whose names were quite literally positions in a sequence. Efficient. Not, it must be said, especially imaginative. Try to picture a schoolroom organized on those principles, where calling one name brings half the class to its feet. But the system made perfect sense inside Roman assumptions, where the family line mattered more than whichever individual happened to be standing in it. Repeating a name was not laziness. It was a statement that the household continued, that the ancestors were still somehow present, that this boy stood where his father and his grandfather had stood before him. It simply also happened to make introductions at a large dinner party a small logistical adventure. Now consider living in a world where almost anything might turn out to be a message. A bird crossing the sky from the wrong direction. A dog howling in the small hours. Somebody sneezing at precisely the wrong moment in an important discussion. To the Romans, these were not coincidences to be shrugged away. They were signals, and reading them correctly was a serious professional discipline. Before major public decisions, and certainly before any military action, priests known as augurs would watch the behavior of birds. Which way they flew, how they called, whether they came from the left or from the right, all of it was interpreted within an established framework, as approval, as warning, or as refusal. Imagine moving a modern meeting because the birds outside were behaving oddly. In Rome that would have been expected, and pressing ahead regardless marked you as careless with everyone's safety. A trace of the practice survives in our language, every time something happens under favourable auspices. There was a second and older tradition, inherited largely from the Etruscans, in which specialist priests studied the liver of a sacrificed animal, reading its shape and markings against a kind of map of the heavens to judge whether the gods were content. Bronze models of livers survive, divided into carefully labelled regions, which shows how systematic it was meant to be. If the signs came out badly, plans could be postponed. Generals delayed engagements. The rituals came first, and getting them wrong was thought to spoil whatever followed. To a modern ear that sounds like superstition standing in the way of business. To a Roman it was closer to due diligence, a way of keeping the state on working terms with the powers that governed the world. Ignoring the signs was reckless rather than brave. There is a well-known story, repeated by later writers, of a commander at sea who was told that the sacred chickens would not eat, a plain signal to wait, and who is said to have had them put over the side with a remark about letting them drink instead. The battle that followed went very badly, and the tale was retold for centuries as a warning. It is said, too, that Julius Caesar set aside several warnings in the days before his assassination in 44 before the Common Era, including the famous one about the middle of March. History was not kind to that decision. For Romans, the world was full of quiet instructions, and sensible people took the trouble to read them. Rome also cared a great deal about appearance. Smooth skin, a pale complexion, carefully arranged hair and well-chosen clothing all signalled status, leisure and refinement. The methods used to achieve those things, however, were sometimes rather more adventurous than the results suggest. Cosmetics were made from natural materials, which sounds reassuring only until you ask which natural materials. Pale skin was fashionable among women of the wealthier classes, precisely because it implied a life spent indoors rather than out under the sun. To achieve it, some face powders were made with white lead, ground fine and worked into a paste. Nobody at the time understood that it was harmful. They knew only that it gave that soft, even, luminous pallor rather better than chalk did. Cheeks were coloured with red ochre or plant dyes, eyes darkened with soot or powdered minerals, and the whole effect kept up by attentive daily work. From here, it looks alarming. From there, it was simply what one did before going out. Recipes were copied, argued over and written down, and the poet Ovid thought the subject worth a poem of its own. A few of the surviving preparations call for ingredients no modern chemist would allow anywhere near a face, and those we can leave quietly on the page where we found them. Hair mattered at least as much. Wealthy women sat for hours while skilled dressers built up architectural arrangements of braids, curls, and pinned coils, some tall enough to need a frame beneath to hold their shape. Those dressers were very often enslaved women whose craft was genuinely expert and whose lives were not their own, and much of the hair itself came from enslaved people across the empire, an uncomfortable fact worth stating plainly. Wigs and hairpieces were common. Fair hair came south from the provinces beyond the Alps, darker hair travelled in from further east, and dyes and powders were used to chase whichever shade was in favour that season. Men were not exempt from any of this. Grooming was part of public credibility, and barbershops were social hubs where beards were trimmed, hair cut, and the news of the day circulated at a volume the customers evidently enjoyed. Iron razors, and very little in the way of soap, meant that a shave asked something of a man's nerve, and an inexperienced barber could leave a customer marked for a week. A young man's first shave was an occasion in its own right, marked with ceremony and small gifts. 2,000 years on, the underlying worries are unchanged. Clear skin, decent hair, looking capable in public. Only the ingredients have improved. And through all of it, at very nearly every hour, people were drinking wine. Morning, midday, evening, wine was simply present. Drinking wine unmixed was considered the mark of somebody with no self-command, or of foreigners who did not know any better, and the polite practice was to combine 1 part wine with 2 or 3 parts water, warmed a little for winter, or cooled with snow brought down from the hills by anyone who. Before we picture a city permanently unsteady on its feet, though, one detail matters enormously. Romans almost always diluted it, could afford it. Even diluted, it ran through the whole day. It was drunk at meals, offered to guests, taken while resting after the baths, poured while business was discussed. In a crowded city where the water supply varied from street to street, it was often simply the safer choice. There were countless varieties, from the thin, sharp local stuff sold by the jug to celebrated vintages aged for decades, stored in tall clay amphorae, sealed with wax and labelled with the estate, the year, and the name of the consul who held office when the grapes were picked. A wealthy host bringing out a jar like that was making a statement, and everyone reclining at that table understood precisely what it had cost him. Wine collecting, it turns out, is a very old habit. Long before temperature-controlled cellars existed, Roman households were storing sealed amphorae in cool back rooms and scratching the year onto the clay so they would remember what was inside. Certain vintages became legendary, spoken of the way collectors today speak of a famous decade, and a good jar could be brought out at exactly the right moment to make a quiet point about the taste of the host. But Romans did not stop at wine and water. They liked to tinker. Honey went in, and herbs and spices carried up from the eastern trade routes. Pine resin went into some jars, partly to preserve the wine and partly out of long habit. And in certain regions a little seawater was stirred in as well, which sounds startling now, and was then simply one of the ways a wine could be made. The most beloved of these mixtures was mulsum, wine sweetened with honey and warmed with spices, usually poured at the beginning of a meal to open the appetite and settle everyone into a friendly mood. The salted versions are a harder sell across 2,000 years, though every culture has a drink that outsiders find puzzling and locals find perfectly reasonable. What matters is that Romans thought about flavour deliberately. They blended and diluted, warmed their cups in winter, chilled them with snow when snow could be carried down from the mountains, and held firm opinions about every stage of it. Because that was the other thing. Dinner in a well-off Roman house was not a matter of sitting upright at a table for 40 minutes. Guests reclined on couches set around a low central table, propped on the left elbow, eating with the right hand, so that conversation travelled easily from couch to couch. Servants moved along the edges, refilling cups almost as fast as they emptied. Musicians played, a poet might read out something new, performers arrived between courses, and the courses themselves unrolled for hours, drifting from small salted dishes through roasted meats and on into fruit, nuts and yet more wine. Even watered down, an evening like that added up. Roman writers made endless jokes about guests who had rather overdone it, and the moralists complained that too much wine produced poor judgment and decisions that looked considerably worse in the morning, which is a complaint that has aged remarkably well. 2,000 years later, people still gather in the evening, still pour something, and still talk far longer than they meant to. The cups have changed shape, the ritual underneath them has barely moved. Romans understood that conversation loosens when the wine does, and that a shared table is one of the oldest pieces of social machinery there is. Now, after a day of work and errands, a visit to the baths and perhaps rather more diluted wine than intended, a Roman wanted entertainment. And Roman entertainment was loud, enormous, and unlike anything else in the ancient world. The most famous form was the gladiatorial games, staged in vast stone amphitheatres, of which the Colosseum is only the grandest survivor. Tens of thousands of people filed in through numbered entrances, holding tokens that told them exactly where to sit, arranged by rank, so that the whole shape of society was on display in the seating quite as much as on the sand below. On hot days, a great canvas awning was hauled out over the crowd by men working the ropes like sailors, because the building had been designed by people who knew precisely how long a crowd will sit still in the sun. The fighters were skilled specialists, trained in schools under strict routines and matched by style, so that a man with a net and trident might face a man with a heavy shield and a short sword. The successful ones became famous, their names scratched onto walls in Pompeii by admirers and argued over in the street much as people argue about athletes today. But it is worth saying plainly what sat underneath that fame. Most gladiators were enslaved men, prisoners taken in war, or people condemned by the courts, and their celebrity did not make them free. Romans admired their courage without troubling themselves much about how they had come to be standing in the arena at all, and the distance between that admiration and that reality is one of the honest, uncomfortable facts of Roman life. The games included a great deal more than fighters. There were animal displays and hunts, the venations, in which creatures from the far edges of the empire were brought into the arena. Lions and leopards came from North Africa, bears from the mountains, and on rare occasions elephants. The logistics were staggering. Animals had to be trapped, caged, fed, shipped across the sea and moved along roads for weeks. Trained hunters faced them, and sometimes condemned prisoners were sent out with very little chance, which the Romans regarded as a form of public punishment. To modernize, that is difficult, and there is no need to pretend otherwise. To Romanize, it was a demonstration of reach. An empire that could take a leopard from a distant hillside and deliver it alive to a city crowd on a chosen afternoon plainly controlled a very great deal of the world. Between the fights came spectacle of another kind altogether. Whole episodes from mythology were staged with costumes and machinery, and famous battles reenacted with the sand raked and reshaped to suit the story. In a few extraordinary cases, arenas were flooded to stage mock sea battles. The Naumachii with real boats and real crews manoeuvring across water channeled in for the day. Ancient accounts describe the crowds as astonished. A lake appearing inside a stone building was, quite simply, a thing that ought not to have been possible. The atmosphere in the stands was closer to a modern stadium than to any solemn ceremony. Vendors worked the crowd selling food and drink. People shouted, waved cloths, took sides, made small bets, and weighed one fighter against another with the enormous confidence of men who had never held a sword in their lives. Emperors and magistrates understood all of this perfectly. Games were expensive, and they were paid for as a public gift, a way of showing generosity and keeping the city in a good mood. The poet Juvenal gave the strategy its famous shorthand, complaining that the Roman people, who had once handed out armies and empires, now longed for only two things: bread and circuses. Feed them and entertain them, and politics could carry on quietly elsewhere. The stands still fill, the crowds still roar. The rules are very much kinder now, but the appetite for spectacle has not moved an inch. Religion in Rome was not something set aside for one day of the week. It was stitched all the way through the ordinary hours. Romans believed the world was thick with gods and lesser spirits, who took an interest in almost everything, from the outcome of a battle to the health of a herd to the hope that tomorrow's bread would rise properly. Every house had a small shrine to the household spirits, where the head of the household might offer crumbs or a splash of wine as easily and as automatically as we might check a lock before bed. And because the gods were assumed to be paying attention, people spent a great deal of time talking to them, in prayers, in offerings, and very often in writing. All across the Roman world, people left messages for their gods, carved into stone, scratched onto thin sheets of metal, engraved on small altars. Many were simple thanks for something already granted: a recovery from illness, a safe birth, a voyage survived. Others were requests, and they could be wonderfully specific. A merchant might ask Mercury for profitable dealings. A soldier might ask Mars for protection before a campaign. A traveller heading out to sea might leave something for Neptune, on the sensible principle that it was better to have made the gesture than not. Roman religion worked rather like a contract. You asked, you offered, and you hoped the divine party would keep its side of the arrangement. One particularly human version of this was the curse tablet, a thin sheet of lead on which somebody wrote out a grievance and asked a god to do something about it. The requests are often startlingly ordinary. A rival charioteer might be asked to lose his footing at the turn. A thief who had taken a cloak from the baths might be asked to sleep badly until the cloak came back. Once written, the tablet would be rolled or folded, sometimes pierced with a nail, and left somewhere the gods could be trusted to see it: a temple, a spring, a well, occasionally a grave. Hundreds have been recovered from a single sacred spring in Britain alone. It amounts to a supernatural complaints procedure. Rather than posting an angry message for strangers to read, you wrote it out carefully, addressed it upward, and dropped it into deep water. People clearly believed in it. Shrines across the empire gathered thousands of small offerings and inscriptions, until the walls around a popular altar were crowded with the concerns of ordinary lives. Roman religion was not remote or abstract, it was personal and close at hand. You addressed a god much as you might address a powerful patron, respectfully, hopefully, and every so often with a very precise request concerning a neighbour who had been difficult about a boundary wall. Another piece of Roman normality feels genuinely strange from a distance, and that is the raising of children. In wealthy households, parents were often not the people who spent the most hours with their own sons and daughters. Elite families relied on nurses, attendants, tutors, and household staff, many of them enslaved, to feed, watch, teach and supervise children from infancy onward, overseeing meals, dress, manners, lessons and movements through the day. Upper-class Roman parenting looked rather less like modern family life and rather more like the running of a small institution. The wet nurse mattered enormously. In many aristocratic homes, mothers did not nurse their own infants, and the woman who did was frequently an enslaved member of the household. Ancient writers argued about this at length. Some insisted that a mother should nurse her own child, believing that the bond formed in those early months shaped everything that came after. Others held that the child would turn out perfectly well, and by perfectly well, they seem to have meant wealthy, well-spoken, and a little emotionally formal, which does describe a fair number of Roman aristocrats. What those debates rarely acknowledged is that the whole arrangement rested on the unfree labour of women who had no say in it at all, and that is worth remembering alongside the philosophy. As children grew, tutors took over. Boys from prosperous families were drilled in reading, writing, literature and rhetoric, because public speaking was the skill that opened every door in Roman public life. They learned how to stand, how to gesture, and how to win an argument without appearing to gloat. Girls in many households were educated too, and there is good evidence of Roman women who read widely and wrote well, though their training leaned toward the management of a household and preparation for marriage. In both cases, much of the teaching came from someone other than a parent, often a paedagogus who walked the child to lessons and stayed beside them through the day. And the Roman household was rarely a small thing. It could include grandparents, cousins, dependents, freed former slaves still attached to the family, enslaved workers, and clients who arrived at dawn to pay their respects. A child there grew up not inside a tight nuclear family, but inside a busy social organism with its own hierarchies and rhythms. The father held legal and symbolic authority over all of it. The mother could be affectionate, formidable, and deeply involved, and many clearly were. And that brings us to the strangest thing about ancient Rome, which is not the public latrines, or the laundries with their unlikely cleaning methods, or the shared bathhouses, or the reclining dinners, or the omens read from the flight of birds, or the beauty creams, or the fact that a great many. But the daily work of care was spread across many hands. To Romans this was practical and unremarkable. To us it feels curiously formal, as though family life had been organized into a system which, for the wealthy, it more or less had been. Men in any given street were named Marcus. The strangest thing is that none of it seemed strange to them. It was simply life, in the way that we do not remark on our own habits. Normal is not a fixed quantity. It is cultural, assembled out of whatever surrounds you from birth, and whatever your neighbours accept without comment. If everyone you know goes to the bathhouse, bathhouses are normal. If everyone watches the birds before a decision, birds are important. If everyone drinks watered wine at midday, that is simply an ordinary afternoon. And in fairness, people some centuries from now may look back at us with exactly the same puzzled expression. They may wonder why we sat alone in metal boxes in long, unmoving lines every morning, why we spent so much of our waking life looking into small, glowing rectangles, and why we paid so much for hot bean water in order to feel human before 9 o'clock. From where they will be standing, we may not look especially well adjusted either. That is the quiet lesson Rome leaves behind. Civilizations are remembered for their conquests and their monuments, but also for the small things, the routines nobody thought worth writing down because everyone already knew them. Marble temples tell us what a people admired. Their dinners, their laundries, their face creams and their street food tell us how they actually lived. And Rome, for all its grandeur, was gloriously, confidently, sometimes uncomfortably human. Now the story travels south across the water, to a city Rome would come to know very well indeed. The first light of morning slides over the great harbour of Carthage, turning the sea into a wide sheet of copper and gold. Long before the merchants in the fine houses on the hill have stirred, the docks are already working. Hulls creak against wooden piers, ropes strain and slacken with the swell. Sailors call to one another in half a dozen languages, and the smell of salt water mixes with wood smoke and warm oil drifting up from the stalls near the gates. Carthage was one of the busiest ports in the ancient Mediterranean, founded by Phoenician settlers from Tyre and grown into a great power in its own right, built on shipping, craftsmanship, and the patient accumulation of trade routes. Its inner naval harbour was a marvel of engineering, a circular basin ringed with covered ship sheds, and its shipwrights were among the most admired of the age. Vessels arrived daily from Sicily, Sardinia, the coasts of Iberia and the distant Levant, carrying grain, metals, dyed cloth, wine and pottery. With them came sailors who had been weeks at sea, dockhands who had been hauling cargo since before sunrise, and traders who had begun negotiating prices while most of the city was still asleep. And every one of them shared a single pressing need. They were hungry. So near the harbour gates the vendors set up. Some simply unfold the wooden table. Others coax charcoal alive in a clay brazier until it glows a steady orange. Within minutes a quiet street becomes a morning market, and breakfast in Carthage is fast, cheap and eaten. One vendor tips a handful of small silver fish into shimmering oil, and the sound of it carries the whole length of the quay. The sound of small fish meeting hot oil carries further than it has any right to. It is a thin, busy crackle, and along the quaysides of Carthage it works on a passing sailor, rather the way a supper bell works on a hungry household. He slows without quite deciding to. The fish were lifted from the water only a few hours earlier, in the shallows beyond the harbour mouth, and they are cooked almost as fast as they were caught, tipped into shimmering oil, drawn out gold, scattered with salt and crushed herbs. In the harbour district, this is one of the most beloved things a person can buy with a single small coin. A few paces along, another seller is building neat towers of barley flatbread, the round still warm enough to soften the cool morning air above them. Barley was the everyday grain of the Carthaginian world, cheaper than wheat and generous in the way that matters most to someone who will spend the next 10 hours lifting things. Dock workers tear the bread into rough pieces, dip them into little bowls of olives or press them against soft cheese, and are already walking back towards the warehouses before the last mouthful is finished. Beyond the bread, a woman lays out trays of honey cakes, sticky and golden and faintly perfumed, and they draw the eye simply because sweetness is a rare thing here. There is no sugar in this world, nothing crystallized, nothing refined, nothing waiting in a paper wrapper. A sailor who's just been paid for a delivery might buy one on impulse, finish it in 3 bites on the way back to his ship, and think about it for the rest of the week. And everywhere, over every counter, clay cups of watered wine pass from hand to hand. In Carthage, as across most of the ancient Mediterranean, wine was almost never drunk as it came from the jar. Vendors cut it with water and sometimes with herbs, making a light drink that refreshed a working man without leaving him unsteady on wet stone steps. Within an hour, the whole market is going at full volume, and men are eating fast, wiping their hands on their tunics and vanishing back into the machinery of trade. Breakfast in Carthage is not a ritual to be lingered over. It is fuel, poured into a city that never quite stops moving. As the morning brightens, the noise does not fade. If anything, it thickens. More ships come in on the swell, More cargo is hauled up out of the holds, and the smell of cooking drifts through the lanes near the port like an invitation nobody sent but everybody accepts. If one quality defines street food in this city, it is speed. A sailor may have only a short gap before the next load of amphorae must come ashore. A porter is paid for the task and not for the hour, so a minute spent sitting is a minute unpaid. A trader is in the middle of 3 conversations at once, half of them about prices and half about tides. Nobody in this district can afford a long, slow meal, and the food has arranged itself accordingly. So it is simple, and the simplest thing of all is bread. Barley flatbread is the backbone of the harbour, stacked in wide woven baskets, a breath of warm grain rising out of them each time a cloth is lifted. It is dense, a little coarse, nothing like the airy loaves of a modern bakery. But it is filling, it keeps well, and it costs almost nothing. For the working crowd, those 3 virtues outrank any question of texture. Hardly anyone eats it plain. Small clay bowls of olives sit on nearly every table, because Carthage held some of the most fertile country in North Africa, land where olive trees stood in patient silver-green ranks across the hills behind the city. The olives are salty and slightly bitter, kept in brine, and dock workers eat them between bites of bread with the unhurried competence of people who have done this every day since childhood. Carthaginian farming was famously skillful. It is said that when the wars were long over, the Roman Senate ordered a Carthaginian treatise on agriculture, the work of a writer named Mago, to be translated into Latin and studied seriously, which is a remarkable compliment from a people who rarely had a kind word to spare for their old rivals. A great deal of what Rome said about Carthage was propaganda, written by the winning side long after the fact. What the fields and the olive presses say is rather different. This was a civilization of patient agricultural science, of careful irrigation and long horizons, of orchards planted by people who did not expect to see them at their best. Sometimes the meal becomes a little more interesting. Some sellers offer spreads of crushed herbs, garlic and olive oil, worked together in a bowl until they are thick and green and fragrant. Others sell soft cheese wrapped in leaves, made from goat or sheep milk on farms an hour's walk beyond the walls. And a fortunate customer might find small pieces of salted fish to tuck inside the flatbread, folding it over into something entirely recognizable as a sandwich to anyone eating lunch at a desk today. But the true talent of these vendors is not cookery, it is efficiency. A customer arrives, sets a small coin on the scarred wooden table, takes bread and olives, and is gone in the space of a few breaths. There is no queue in any organized sense, and no conversation beyond a nod. The next hungry worker has already stepped forward. Multiply that by every stall along every lane, and hundreds of these tiny transactions happen every hour. Food moving through the crowd almost as fast as cargo moves through the docks. And as the sun climbs higher over a very blue sea, the sellers know that the real rush has not arrived yet. By the middle of the day, the harbour district reaches its loudest and most crowded hours. Timber cranes creak as they swing loads out over the water. Amphorae come down onto stone with a hollow clatter. Merchants call prices across the wharves in several languages at once, because this is a city where Punic and Greek and Numidian and a dozen other tongues brush past one another in a single afternoon. The market streets behind the docks beat with the same restless energy, and now one smell overtakes all the others, which is the smell of hot olive oil. If bread and olives are the fastest food in Carthage, fried fish is the most tempting. The fish come in constantly from small boats that work the water just outside the harbour and never go far. Their crews are back before most of the city is properly awake, baskets heavy with sardines, anchovies, and whatever else the nets happen to find. The catch is often sold on the spot to vendors working near the docks, and within minutes of leaving the boat, it is already cooking. The street cooks heat wide pans of bronze or thick clay over charcoal braziers, and there is a particular moment, once the oil begins to shimmer and the first fish go in, when the crackle cuts cleanly through every other noise in the market. The fish are prepared as plainly as possible, dusted with a little barley flour or a handful of crushed herbs, and dropped straight into the oil. No sauces, no complications, nothing that takes time, just quick frying until the skin turns crisp and gold. The finished fish are piled onto wooden trays lined with flatbread or woven reeds, and a handful costs a few small coins. Dock workers often eat them right there beside the stall, passing a fish from one hand to the other because it is too hot to hold. Some fold them into barley bread, making a rough and thoroughly satisfying parcel. Others simply salt them and eat as they walk, with the practiced speed of people who have learned exactly how to fit a meal into a gap. Nearby, another seller offers something a little grander, which is grilled octopus. A merchant with an hour to spare, a sailor with fresh coins in his belt, two traders quietly celebrating a shipment that arrived intact, which in the ancient Mediterranean was never a thing to be assumed. Even so, the pace never really slows. Food here is not about leisure. It is about keeping an immense commercial machine turning. Ships must sail on the next favourable wind, warehouses must be filled and emptied and filled again, and cargo must travel from hold to market, and from market to the caravans waiting inland. Every man working the docks knows the same small truth, which is that a hot piece of fried fish may be the only pause his day contains. As the afternoon comes on, the smells of fish and warm bread still hold the district, but among all the salt and smoke, another scent quietly draws people sideways, and that is sweetness. Sweet food was uncommon in the ancient Mediterranean. There was no refined sugar, no chocolate, nothing resembling a sweet shop on a corner. What there was, in generous quantity, was honey. Beekeeping was widespread across the countryside Carthage controlled. Clay hives sat in patient rows on rural farms, and honey travelled into the city in sealed jars, carried on the backs of donkeys or stacked in carts beside the grain. For a street vendor, it was close to a perfect ingredient. Sweet, sticky, slow to spoil, and beautifully suited to small things sold in seconds. The most popular of those small things was the honey cake. They were modest and round and dense, made from barley or wheat flour, worked together with crushed nuts, sesame seeds, and a great deal of honey. The dough was shaped into little discs and baked on flat hot stones or inside simple domed clay ovens, and once they came out they were often brushed with warm honey a second time, so that the surface caught the light and went on glistening all afternoon. A tray of them attracted attention very quickly. Young apprentices from the warehouses spent their few coins on one before going back to the ledgers and the lifting. Sailors, newly paid after weeks of ship rations, which were nourishing in roughly the way a plank is nourishing, treated themselves without much argument. Even merchants sometimes broke off a negotiation long enough to buy one, still talking, still gesturing, cake in hand. Each seller had a variation, and regular customers were loyal to theirs. Some scattered crushed pistachios or extra sesame across the top. Some pressed in dried figs, or dates that had travelled a very long way indeed, arriving along a trade network that reached across North Africa and towards the Near East. Every stall had its own small twist, and people would walk past 3 of them to reach the 4th. But like everything else here, the pleasure was brief. Nobody stood about admiring a cake. It was bought, it was eaten in a few bites, and the buyer was gone, because there were ships to load and contracts to argue over and cargo to shift before the light went. Still, for that short moment, there was a genuine luxury in the middle of the noise, a reminder that life in Carthage was not only labour and ledgers, and that a person could stand in a shouting harbour with sticky fingers and be, briefly and completely, content. By now the heat has settled in properly. The paving stones hold it and hand it back. The air thickens with fish and oil and baking grain, and dock workers stop to wipe their faces before hauling the next load along the wharf, while sailors climb in and out of the ships with ropes and jars and crates balanced on their shoulders. At this hour, food alone is not enough. People need something to drink. There is water, of course, and rather good water at that. Carthage was known for the care it took over water, for cisterns and reservoirs that caught the winter rain and kept the city supplied through the long dry months, a quiet piece of engineering that says as much about the place as any wall or watchtower. But in the crowded harbour lanes, many workers prefer something with a little more character, and what they choose is wine, though not wine as a modern drinker would picture it. In the ancient Mediterranean, taking wine undiluted was widely regarded as excessive and rather uncivilized, and Carthaginians, like their neighbours across the sea, mixed it with water almost without exception. Vendors near the harbour make a speciality of exactly this. Clay jugs stand on wooden tables, cool and beaded with damp in the heat. The seller dips a ladle and fills simple cups of pottery or metal, handing them across to whoever has stopped. The wine is cut with cool water and often flavoured with mint or thyme or a few crushed fennel seeds, which lift the whole thing into something fresh and faintly green. Some sellers stir in a little honey as well, making a drink that sits somewhere between a cordial and a herbal infusion. For a sailor just off a long voyage, this is a small miracle. Life at sea meant water kept in wooden barrels for weeks at a time, and by the time a ship reached port, that water had usually stopped being pleasant and had sometimes stopped being wise. A cool cup of watered wine with herbs in it was an entirely different proposition, and it is easy to imagine a crew coming ashore and following the sound of a ladle before anything else. So the dock workers gather briefly at these stalls, 3 or 4 at a time, leaning against a wall or a stack of crates while they drink. The talk is short and practical. Cargo that has not arrived. A rumour about a fleet expected within the week. The heat, which everyone agrees is worse than last year, as everyone has agreed every year since the city was founded. Then the cups go back, another man steps up, and the ladle dips again, and the rhythm continues all afternoon. Behind every tray of fried fish and every stack of barley bread, there is somebody who was awake long before the sun. The street vendors of the harbour district are among the hardest working people in the city, and their world is a small one beside that of the merchants whose benches cross the entire sea. A vendor's whole business might amount to a wooden table, a clay oven, a few baskets of ingredients and, most valuable of all, a good position near the docks. Because position is everything. The best pitches sit along the narrow lanes that link the harbour to the warehouses and the markets beyond, where the flow of sailors and porters and traders never really stops. A seller who holds a good corner can serve hundreds of small meals between sunrise and dusk, and such corners are inherited, defended, and now and then disputed with great feeling. Many of these vendors come from ordinary Carthaginian families who have worked the same few yards of market for generations, learning the trade from a grandmother who learned it from hers. Others arrived from villages further inland, drawn by the noise and the coins. And some are foreigners entirely, settled in the city through the very trade routes that carried the dates and the tin and the famous purple dye, and now standing over a brazier before dawn, feeding a harbour that never quite stops being hungry. Punic was the everyday speech, the language the first settlers had carried west from the Phoenician coast, but a person waiting for lunch might also hear Greek from a shipmaster out of Sicily, Latin from a merchant with cargo to declare, Numidian and Libyan from the countryside inland, and the Carthage was a city of many tongues, and nowhere was that plainer than in the narrow lanes behind the harbour, where the food stalls stood shoulder to shoulder. Softer accents of Iberia from crews who had wintered beside the silver mines. None of this seemed remarkable to the people standing in it. It was simply one of the sounds the harbour made, along with gulls and rigging and the long creak of loading gear. Many of the vendors had narrowed their trade down to a single thing done extremely well. One might sell nothing but small fish, sardines or anchovies, tipped by the handful into hot oil and lifted out again in less time than it takes to describe, because a cook who can feed 50 people in an hour will always eat better than a cook who can feed 12. Another sold only flatbread, sliding pale rounds in and out of a domed clay oven and stacking them in a tower that never quite stopped shrinking. A third arranged honey cakes in careful rows on a board, sticky and gold and deliberately set at eye level, in the reasonable hope that a sailor with a few coins and no particular plan for them would glance down and change his mind about being sensible. The work behind those counters was relentless in a quiet way. Charcoal had to be held at the right heat, coaxed with a fan when it sank and banked when it threatened to scorch. Oil had to be topped up and strained. Dough had to be mixed hours before anyone was hungry, so that the bread would be ready at the moment they were. Vendors read the crowd the way a farmer reads weather. They knew that when a particular vessel came round the mole, 100 men would be free within the hour, and that when the loading gangs fell quiet at midday, the rush would arrive all at once. The competition was genuine. 3 stalls within a dozen paces might all be selling fried fish and bread, so the difference between a good day and a poor one came down to very small margins. Slightly fresher fish, a quicker hand, an extra thread of honey over a cake, given without being asked. Reputation travelled fast where the same faces passed the same corners twice a day, and once a dock gang had decided which stall was theirs, they stayed loyal, with a stubbornness that had little to do with cooking and a great deal to do with being recognised. So a rhythm settled over all that noise. Coins tapped on wooden boards. Food went one way and payment went the other. Men ate quickly, wiped their hands on whatever was nearest, and vanished back into the machinery of trade. By mid-afternoon the vendors were already thinking ahead, because more ships would come, more crews would step onto the stone, and the streets would fill again with people who wanted something hot and wanted it soon. What makes the food of that harbour so interesting, looking back, is not really the food itself. It is where it came from. Carthage sat near the centre of one of the great trading networks of the ancient world, and ships arrived constantly from every direction, carrying metals and cloth, spices and grain, timber and livestock. But a ship brought more than cargo. Sailors carried tastes with them, and habits, and the memory of how things were done at home, and all of that came ashore alongside the jars. The result was a kind of quiet cross-pollination that nobody planned and nobody bothered to write down. A sailor from the Iberian coast might find salted fish prepared much the way it was in the western ports he knew. A trader out of Sicily could buy olives and cheese that tasted like the fields he had left a week earlier. A merchant from the Levant sometimes recognized a dish that reminded him of the eastern shore, which was, after all, where the ancestors of the Carthaginians had come from in the first place. Olives stayed the constant, though they might be dressed with herbs that had travelled a very long way. Flatbread might be scattered with sesame seeds carried along routes reaching towards the Near East. Honey cakes sometimes held nuts grown on the far side of the sea. Even fish, the plainest thing on offer, varied from stall to stall. Some cooks did nothing but fry it in good oil and serve it as it was, on the sound principle that fresh fish does not need help. Others rubbed it first with crushed herbs. A few offered the salty, savoury sauce made from cured fish that was loved all around the Mediterranean, and which sailors from a dozen different coasts would have recognised at once as the taste of somewhere familiar. These were small variations, hardly worth remarking on at the time, and together they turned a few streets of cheap lunches into a crossroads. A dock worker eating with one hand and holding his tally in the other might be tasting ingredients that had crossed 1,000 miles of water to reach him, and would probably have been faintly amused if anyone had troubled to tell him so. For Carthage, that variety was a source of pride. The city had begun as a Phoenician settlement, founded by people from Tyre who crossed the sea and built on a good defensible headland. It is said that the founding was led by a princess named Elissa, whom later writers called Dido, though that story reached us through Greek and Roman hands and has clearly been polished along the way. The name the citizens themselves used was Carthage, the new city, and over the centuries the new city grew into one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated powers of the ancient Mediterranean. Its merchants worked the routes along North Africa, into Iberia, around Sicily and Sardinia, and out past the straits into the open Atlantic, which was further than most of their contemporaries were willing to sail. Its harbour was an engineering marvel, a rectangular basin for trade opening into a circular naval harbour where warships could be drawn up under cover in neat radiating berths. Every ship that tied up strengthened that web a little, and the markets displayed the result in the plainest form imaginable, which is to say, lunch. That is worth pausing on. The grand banquets of wealthy Carthaginian houses have left almost no trace, while the ordinary food did the real work of the city. A ship's captain and the man who carried his cargo might buy from the same counter minutes apart and eat the same bread. The ingredients came from many lands. The experience was entirely simple. Eat quickly, return to work, watch the next sail come round the point. As the afternoon softened into evening, the harbour changed its tempo rather than stopping. Some ships had already slipped out on the falling wind, hoping to reach the next anchorage before dark. Others were tied up for the night, their crews suddenly free. The last loads went into the warehouses, merchants counted the day's takings, and men who had been lifting since before dawn stood up straight and discovered exactly how much of their backs they had been using. The food stalls did not close. If anything, the evening brought a second wave, and a more pleasant one. Sailors who had spent the day mending sail or shifting cargo finally had time to eat properly rather than in snatches. Warehouse guards coming on for the night shift stopped for something to carry them through the small hours. Traders wandered out looking for something warm, and the vendors made ready for them. Braziers that had been allowed to sink were stirred back to life, sending up small sparks that rose and went out against a darkening sky. Fish still sizzled, at an unhurried pace now. Bread sellers brought out rounds baked earlier and laid them briefly over the coals to soften them again, a trick so old and so effective that people still do it. Evening also brought heavier food. Bowls of stewed lentils appeared on the counters, thick enough to stand a spoon in. Lentils were a staple all around that sea, cheap to grow, easy to store, and generous with the kind of nourishment a working body needs. Simmered slowly with garlic and herbs and finished with olive oil, they made the sort of meal that quietly reconciles a tired person to their day. Some stalls offered small portions of roasted meat as well, goat or lamb threaded onto skewers and turned over an open flame. Meat cost more, a modest luxury. A sailor newly paid after a good voyage might allow himself one, standing in the warm air while the fat hissed into the fire, feeling briefly like a man of means. Nearby, wine sellers poured wine cut generously with water and sometimes flavoured with herbs, which was the normal way to drink it, and skipping the water was thought rather uncivilized. The mood loosened. Conversations that had been 3 words long at noon now stretched out comfortably. Sailors traded stories about storms survived and harbours visited, improving them slightly with each telling. Oil lamps came out, hung from stall posts or carried from place to place, and their light caught on bronze pans and glazed jars and the damp stone of the quay, turning a working street into something almost companionable. For an hour or two the harbour stopped being a machine for moving goods and became a place where the people who kept a great city alive stood about together in the dark. Then, at last, the stalls closed. The fires under the clay braziers sank to embers and went dull, and the trays that had held fried fish and honey cakes and stacks of barley bread were wiped down and put away. Vendors counted coins by lamplight with the particular concentration of people doing arithmetic they care about, and beyond the harbour wall the sea went on tapping quietly at the stones, as it had done long before the city was built and would go on doing long afterwards. None of this food was ever meant to be elegant. It belonged to the working life of a port, and yet it reveals something rather lovely about the place. Every connection Carthage had built showed up on those counters. The olives came from groves spread across North Africa, the fish from the water just outside the harbour mouth, the honey from farms inland, the nuts and herbs along routes that crossed seas and deserts. Silver arrived from Iberia and grain from Sicily, and all of it passed within a few streets of a man eating bread with his fingers. For the sailors, of course, the meaning was much simpler. After weeks at sea, the scent of frying fish and fresh bread meant safe harbour. And in the morning, the whole thing would begin again before sunrise. New sails on the horizon, fresh charcoal lit, baskets restacked. In a city built on trade, commerce never really stops. It only pauses long enough for a quick meal. It was into this city, confident and rich and stitched into half the Mediterranean, that a boy was born who would one day march an army over the Alps and unsettle Rome more thoroughly than anyone had managed before. Hannibal Barca grew up in a Carthage that looked, from the outside, entirely unshaken. Fleets went out to Iberia and Sicily and Sardinia and along the African coast. The markets held silver and ivory, grain and spices. But underneath the prosperity lay a wound that had not healed. Only a few years before Hannibal was born, Carthage had lost the first of its long wars with Rome. The fighting had gone on for more than 20 years, largely over Sicily, and it drained both sides in ways neither had imagined when it began. In the end, Carthage came to terms. It gave up territory, agreed to pay an enormous indemnity, and watched Rome establish itself as the leading naval power of the Western Mediterranean, a position Carthaginians had long assumed was theirs by custom. Many found that very hard to accept. Worse followed almost at once when soldiers who had served the city and gone unpaid rose in revolt, and while Carthage was occupied with that emergency, Rome took Sardinia and raised the sum still owed. It was a bitter few years, and it left behind a grievance that would outlast the men who first felt it. Among them was Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca, a commander of real ability who had fought Rome tenaciously through the closing years of the war and was never decisively beaten in the field, at least by the reckoning of the historians who wrote about him. He could not undo the settlement, but he refused to treat it as final. His answer was to rebuild Carthaginian strength somewhere. Rome could not easily interfere, and so he looked west, to Iberia, with its silver, its farmland, and its formidable fighting men. A secure base there might restore the wealth, and in time the army that the war had cost. Hannibal grew up inside that project. It is worth saying plainly that almost everything we know about him was written by Greeks and Romans, often generations later, and that Carthage's own literature was very nearly all lost when the city finally fell. The Romans also left behind a great deal of hostile invention about their rivals, including the sneer of Punic faith, a supposed Carthaginian talent for treachery, which tells us a good deal more about Roman anxiety than about Carthaginian character. So the famous stories deserve to be held gently, as tales about a sophisticated people told mainly by the ones who defeated them. The most famous of them is the oath. It is said that before sailing for Iberia, Hamilcar took his young son to a temple and asked whether he wished to come along on the campaign. The boy agreed at once. His father then led him to the altar and had him swear that he would never be a friend of Rome. Polybius, writing a couple of generations afterwards, recorded the tale, and whether or not every detail of it is accurate, it captures the household well enough. In the Barca family, Rome was not merely a rival city that had won a war. It was the reason for everything that came next. So Hannibal left the familiar streets of his city while still a child and sailed west, and his education began in places very unlike a nobleman's house. He grew up in camps, watching troops drill in the dust of a hot afternoon, listening while his father negotiated with local chieftains, and weighed which alliances would hold and which would need buying again next season. The uplands and river valleys became his schoolroom, and he learned there how armies actually move through difficult country, how supply decides campaigns far more often than courage does, and how to hold together a force drawn from Libyans, Iberians, Numidians and Carthaginians, each with their. When Hamilcar died on campaign, the work passed first to his son-in-law, and then, while Hannibal was still a young man, to Hannibal himself, by which time the family had founded a splendid new port on the Iberian coast and turned the peninsula into the engine of Carthaginian recovery. Own speech, their own weapons, and their own expectations. Long before the Alps, he had already begun gathering the knowledge that would make him one of the most closely studied commanders in history, and the promise made at that altar, whether truly sworn or only remembered that way, had not gone anywhere at all. The great project that Hamilcar Barca had begun in Iberia was never meant to end the way it did. He had spent years turning the southern coast of the peninsula into something that looked less like a frontier and more like a second homeland, and he seems to have imagined a long and patient future for it. But campaigns against local peoples were unpredictable things, fought in river valleys and hill country where the ground itself favoured whoever already lived there, and in one of them Hamilcar was killed. The accounts of exactly how vary, as ancient accounts so often do, and the details matter less than the fact. The man who had carried Carthage's fortunes westward after the first war with Rome was simply gone. It could have unravelled everything. Territories held together by one commander's personality have a way of coming apart the moment he is removed, and there must have been Iberian chieftains who wondered whether the Carthaginian experiment had ended. Instead, the command passed smoothly to another member of the same remarkable family, Hamilcar's son-in-law, remembered by later writers as Hasdrubal the Fair. Hasdrubal was a different sort of man, and he governed differently. Where his father-in-law had preferred the direct argument of an army in the field, Hasdrubal preferred the slower, quieter work of negotiation. He sat down with tribal leaders and arranged understandings and alliances that ran in both directions. He built administration where there had been only garrisons, so that taxes could be gathered and disputes settled and grain moved without a siege every spring. It is said that he married into an Iberian noble family himself, which in that world was less a romance than a treaty sealed by a family tie. His most lasting act was the founding of a city on the southeastern coast, on a magnificent natural harbour ringed by low hills, a place the Carthaginians named with words meaning new city, which history remembers in its Latin form Carthago Nova. It was a superb piece of judgment. The harbour was deep and sheltered, the approaches were easily defended, and inland lay the silver country whose mines would soon pour wealth into Carthaginian hands. Within a generation, the city was the political and economic heart of Carthaginian Iberia, its wharves crowded, its warehouses full, its mint-striking coin that travelled the whole western sea. Silver out of those hills bought grain and ships and the goodwill of allies, and it steadily cleared what Carthage still owed to Rome from the First War. Through all of this, a young man was quietly learning his trade. Hannibal had come to Iberia as a boy in his father's shadow, and he grew up in the odd, hard schoolroom of a field army. He served as an officer. He learned how much bread a marching column eats in a day, how long it takes to get cavalry across a ford, how a mountain people negotiates when it wants tribute, and how it negotiates when it wants a fight. And the soldiers noticed him, which is a very different thing from being noticed by generals. What they noticed, according to writers who came long afterwards and who had their own reasons for shaping the portrait, was that he did not hold himself apart. Many commanders kept a careful distance from the ranks, dining apart, sleeping under proper canvas, riding while others walked. Hannibal, by these accounts, marched with his men, ate roughly what they ate, and lay down to sleep in the same cold camps under the same indifferent stars. He seemed tireless, able to stay in the saddle for distances that wore out other men, and in small skirmishes he showed a restless intelligence about ground, an eye for where a slope would help and where a river would hurt. Soldiers forgive a great deal in a commander who shares their discomfort, and what they gave him in return was loyalty of a kind that armies do not hand out easily. Much of what survives about him, though, was written by Romans who needed their most dangerous enemy to be extraordinary, and the portrait is best held a little loosely. His moment arrived, as such moments often do, through misfortune. Hasdrubal the Fair was assassinated, killed by a local man said to have been avenging a private wrong, and suddenly the largest army in the western Mediterranean stood in Iberia with nobody to command it. The decision fell partly to the soldiers and partly to the Carthaginian officials in the province, and it was made with very little hesitation. Hannibal was only in his mid-20s, which by any ordinary reckoning was young for such a burden, but the troops had already settled the question in their own minds. They proclaimed him general, and Carthage confirmed the choice soon afterwards. The boy who had grown up among tent ropes and baggage trains now held one of the finest fighting forces of the age in his hands, and so his attention turned, almost inevitably, toward the city his father had never stopped thinking about. The instrument he had inherited was formidable. Years of expansion had given Carthage the silver of the interior, allied Iberian communities who could supply fighting men, and a corps of veterans who had campaigned together long enough to trust one another under pressure. Yet none of this was happening in secret. Across the sea, Rome was watching, with a wariness that had never really faded since the first long war between them ended. The two powers were not at war. Both understood perfectly well that the peace between them was a thin sheet of ice, and that sooner or later somebody would step through it. There had been attempts to draw lines, an agreement remembered as the Ebro Treaty had set out. In some form historians still argue over that Carthaginian armies would not push north of the river Ebro. On a map, it looks admirably tidy. The trouble was a city called Saguntum, sitting well to the south of that river, comfortably inside the zone that Carthage regarded as its own, and yet bound by friendship and alliance to Rome. To Hannibal, this was an intolerable arrangement. A Roman ally lodged deep inside Carthaginian Iberia was not a neutral curiosity, it was a doorway, and doorways can be walked through. Left alone, it might become the foothold from which Roman influence spread among peoples Carthage had spent 2 decades cultivating. He also understood something about the Roman Republic that would shape the rest of his life. Rome very rarely abandoned an ally. Press hard enough on one of them, and Rome would be obliged to answer. To move against Saguntum was therefore not simply a local operation. It was a question put directly to the Senate, and he had a fair idea of the answer he would get. Around 219 years before the Common Era, he brought his army up to the city and settled in to besiege it. Saguntum did not fall easily. Its walls were strong and set on high ground, and its people defended them with real determination, mounting sallies, repairing breaches through the night. The siege dragged on month after month, while the Carthaginian lines tightened, cutting the roads and choking off the grain, waiting out a city that had prepared for precisely this. From inside, messengers slipped away toward Rome carrying appeals for help. Rome, however, moved at the speed of Rome. Ambassadors were appointed and instructed. Positions were staked out in the Senate with immense care, and while all that deliberation ground slowly forward, the assault continued far away in Iberia. Eventually, after roughly 8 months of resistance, Saguntum fell. The city was taken and destroyed, and the wealth it had gathered over generations was shared out among the soldiers who had spent a year outside its walls. From where Hannibal stood, this settled the question of who governed Iberia. From where Rome stood, it was something else entirely. It was an insult, publicly delivered, to a republic that measured its own dignity by how it looked after those who had trusted it. Roman envoys sailed to Carthage and demanded that Hannibal be handed over to answer for it. The Carthaginian council refused. With that refusal, the thin ice finally gave way. The scene that followed is one of those ancient set pieces, polished by retelling until it gleams more brightly than the truth probably did. According to later accounts, a Roman ambassador stood before the assembled Carthaginian council, gathered the folds of his toga into a bundle at his chest, and told them that he carried both peace and war in it, and that they might choose which he should let fall. The councillors, refusing to be intimidated, replied that he could give whichever he liked. He opened the fold and said that he gave them war. Whether the words were ever spoken quite like that, the story catches something real about a moment when 2 proud states each decided that backing down would cost more than fighting. So began the second of the great wars between Rome and Carthage, and one of the most extraordinary conflicts in ancient history. Rome's leaders thought they knew how it would go, and their plan was, on paper, rather good. One consular army would sail for North Africa and force Carthage to fight for its survival at home. Another would go to Iberia and dismantle the family's power base at the root. Squeezed from 2 directions, Carthage would be brought to terms before the war had time to grow into anything larger. It was a plan that quietly assumed the enemy would stand still and be attacked. Hannibal had no such intention. Rather than defending Iberia or hurrying home to shield Carthage, he proposed something so audacious that it unsettled even people on his own side. He would not wait for Rome to come to him. He would carry the war into Italy itself, into the heartland from which Roman power was drawn. The difficulty was the getting there. By land it meant an immense march, through territories whose peoples had no particular reason to be helpful, across rivers wide enough to swallow an unprepared army, and finally over the wall of rock that separates Gaul from the Italian plains. The Alps. Most commanders would have looked at that barrier and called the idea impossible. The passes were steep and narrow, the weather turned without warning, and even traders who knew the routes well treated them with respect. But Hannibal had calculated something beyond the mountains. Italy was not a single nation. It was a patchwork of communities bound to Rome by treaties, many signed under pressure, some within living memory. If a powerful Carthaginian army appeared among them, intact and victorious, he believed a good number of those communities would decide that their obligations to Rome had lapsed. The strategy was not really to conquer Italy, it was to unpick it. For this he assembled a force worth pausing over. Thousands of Iberian infantry marched alongside seasoned Libyan troops from the North African heartland. Numidian horsemen, superb light cavalry who rode without heavy tack and fought in loose flowing swarms, went ahead as scouts and screens. Slingers from the Balearic Islands carried a reputation for accuracy that bordered on the uncanny, and it is said that each man went to war with slings of several lengths, one for distant work and one for close. And moving among all of them, patient and enormous, came the war elephants, animals that several Mediterranean powers had used in battle, but which remained rare enough that the sight of them alone could unsteady troops who had never met one. The early stages of the march were already hard work. Some Iberian peoples objected to so large a force crossing their lands and had to be fought. Others simply named a price before they would let the column through. Every river demanded its own small campaign, ferrying men, horses, and baggage across water that was never as shallow as it looked from the bank. Roman scouts began sending back reports of this astonishing movement, and at first Rome struggled to believe them. The notion that a foreign army would deliberately walk into the Alps seemed close to absurd, and Roman commanders went on expecting the fighting to happen in Iberia, or perhaps in Africa. Meanwhile, Hannibal kept moving, reached the Rhone, and got across it with boats and rafts, with floating platforms disguised under earth and branches to coax the elephants aboard. Then only the mountains were left. Ahead of the army rose jagged grey peaks streaked with old snow, thin tracks scratched along the flanks of ravines, and a cold that many of the soldiers, raised in the warm south, had never known. The march into the high country tested everyone. The mountain peoples watched the column come and did not care for it. Some attacked from above, rolling rocks down onto the trail and harrying the baggage where the path narrowed to the width of a single mule. Hannibal had to send detachments ahead to hold the heights, while the rest of the army crept along beneath them. Progress slowed to a crawl. Pack animals lost their footing on ice, carts came apart on the rock, and there was nothing to be done but keep walking. The elephants suffered too. They were not built for freezing air and slippery footing, and their handlers coaxed them forward step by careful step, widening the path in places before they could pass. Through it all, Hannibal kept his hold on the army. He rode among the ranks. He endured what they endured. Later historians describe him halting the column at a high point and gesturing out over the haze toward the plains of Italy far below, telling exhausted men that everything they had marched for lay just beyond the last ridge. Then the weather turned genuinely against them, snow falling heavily enough to erase the trail, and men slipped on ground they could no longer read, and the food ran thin, and hunger and exhaustion moved through the column like a slow tide. Still, it went forward. After weeks of that, the Carthaginians came down out of the mountains into northern Italy. The army that emerged was far smaller than the one that had gone in, and the ancient figures for the losses differ so widely that nobody truly knows. It was also still dangerous, still disciplined, and it had done the thing Rome had considered impossible. When word reached the capital, many Romans could scarcely credit it. For generations, the Alps had been Italy's northern wall. Small raiding parties had crossed before, but never a real army with baggage and cavalry and siege experience. Now one stood on Italian soil, and the Republic hurried to mobilize, sending legions north to meet the invasion before it could work its way deeper. Roman commanders were confident that once the legions closed with this mixed force, discipline would settle the matter quickly. But Hannibal had already begun altering the ground beneath them. The peoples of the northern plains had long resented Roman colonies and Roman roads pushing into their territory, and to some of them the arrival of a Carthaginian army looked less like an invasion than an opportunity. Warriors began drifting into his camp, replacing a good deal of what the mountains had taken. The first real clash came near the river Ticinus, where Roman cavalry met Hannibal's horsemen, the Numidians among them, riding in the fluid, encircling style that Roman riders had never had to answer before. The Carthaginians had the better of it, and the Roman horse withdrew. Their commander, it is said, was wounded and carried from the field by his own young son, who would matter a great deal later on. It was a small engagement by the standards of what was coming. It was also the first quiet indication that the assumptions Rome had carried north with it might not survive contact. In the long ledger of the war that followed, the fight beside the Ticinus was a small thing. A few hours of horsemen wheeling across the flat country of the north, a little dust, a river running cold and grey between its banks. And yet it mattered far out of proportion to its size, because of what it told the Romans about the season they had entered. For the first time, soldiers of the Republic had met Hannibal's army on Italian ground, among their own fields and vineyards, and they had come away beaten. The Roman commander was wounded in the confusion and only just carried clear of it. Some accounts say he was saved by his own young son, a boy who would grow into one of the most formidable generals Rome ever produced. Others credit an enslaved man of the household who rode in and pulled him out. There is no settling it now. Either way, a consul of Rome had been driven from a field by a Carthaginian, and the survivors who withdrew that evening understood that they were no longer dealing with a raid on the frontier. That was the shift. Rome had assumed, reasonably enough, that a war against Carthage would be fought where the last one had been fought, at sea, and in Sicily, and along the coasts of Africa and Iberia, at a comfortable distance from the Italian countryside. Instead, there was an experienced army camped in the valley of the Po, resupplied by Gallic communities with their own long grievances against Roman colonists, led by a man who had already done the impossible once by bringing that army over the Alps in the closing weeks of the year. Whatever else Hannibal Barca was, he was not improvising. The march was not a desperate gamble, but the opening move of a campaign years in the planning. Rome answered, as Rome usually answered, with numbers. The Republic's real strength was never a single brilliant commander. It was the extraordinary depth of its manpower, the ability to raise army after army from its own citizens and from the wide network of Italian allies bound to it by treaty. Legions were summoned north, and a second consular army, recalled from the south where it had been preparing an expedition against Africa, came up the peninsula at speed. The thinking was straightforward, and it had worked many times before. bring enough disciplined heavy infantry to the field, close with the enemy, push, and let the weight of the formation do the arguing. Hannibal understood that thinking perfectly, and he built his war around it. That is what made him so dangerous, and it was never simply courage or the theatre of the elephants. He had studied not only how Roman armies behaved, but how Roman commanders behaved. He knew that a consul held office for a single year and wanted his victory inside it. He knew the legions preferred a straight fight on open ground where their strength told, so he made a habit of offering them exactly the battle they wanted, in a place he had chosen, at an hour he had chosen, with something waiting in it that nobody had told them about. The two sides met again by the Trebia, a river running down out of the hills to join the Po in the last cold weeks of the year. The Roman army believed it had him cornered. Hannibal had walked that ground beforehand and found what he needed, a watercourse with steep, overgrown banks, deep enough to hide men in, close enough to the field to matter. He put a detachment down there in the dark, told the rest of his troops to eat well and warm themselves by the fires, and at first light sent his horsemen splashing across the water to sting the Roman camp and gallop away again. It worked. The Romans came out hungry, into a raw wind, and had to wade a river swollen with winter rain to reach the enemy at all. By the time they formed up on the far bank, they were soaked to the chest and stiff with cold, and the fighting had not yet begun. When it did, Hannibal's plan unfolded almost exactly as he had drawn it. His cavalry, which was the better cavalry, drove the Roman horsemen off the wings and then turned inward against the exposed flanks of the infantry. And at the moment the Roman line was fully committed. The men hidden in the stream rose out of the brush and came in from behind. What followed was less a battle than a collapse of order. Roman formations depended on cohesion, on every man knowing where the line was and which way it faced, and pressure from three directions at once dissolves that knowledge. Thousands were killed or taken prisoner. One block of Roman infantry in the centre, refusing to break, punched straight through the Carthaginian line and marched away intact to the shelter of a nearby colony, which was a remarkable feat of nerve and, in the circumstances, all that could be salvaged. News of it travelled down through Italy faster than any courier, in the way that alarming news does. For the first time in living memory, a foreign army was winning open battles inside the peninsula. Towns that had never expected a war closer than the horizon began quietly repairing their walls. Gallic communities in the north, who had watched Roman surveyors laying out colonies on land they still considered their own, decided the moment had arrived and came in on Hannibal's side exactly as he had counted on. Further south, some allied Italian cities began, very discreetly, to reconsider the arithmetic of their loyalty. The Trebia settled a question. The army that had crossed Iberia, forced its way over the Rhone with elephants ferried on rafts, and survived the Alpine passes in the snow, was not merely an audacious expedition that had arrived half dead and would shortly be swept up. It was a formidable instrument, capable of beating Roman legions on Roman soil, and its commander was better at his craft than anyone Rome currently had to send against him. Greater battles were coming, and worse ones, and the name Hannibal would lodge itself so deeply in the Roman imagination that generations later, long after the danger had passed, parents were still using it to hurry reluctant children indoors at dusk. It is worth pausing there a moment because the Romans wrote most of the history that survives, and they wrote it after they had won. In their telling, Carthage is treacherous, and Hannibal is a kind of weather event, a force of malice sent down over the mountains. What it obscures is that Carthage was a wealthy, literate, deeply sophisticated city with a senate and a written constitution that Greek philosophers studied with genuine admiration, with harbours that impressed everyone who saw them, and with agricultural manuals so respected that the Roman. That is propaganda, and it is very good propaganda, which is why it has lasted 2000 years. Senate had one of them translated into Latin after the city itself had fallen. Its trading reach ran the length of the Mediterranean and out past the straits into the Atlantic. Hannibal was not a barbarian who got lucky with elephants. He was an educated commander from a great commercial power, doing what commanders do, and the reason Rome feared him is that he was extremely good at it. And here is where the story quietly turns, because armies of that size do not run on courage, they run on money. This is the part of ancient history that tends to be left out of the paintings. Behind every marching army and every set of city walls, behind the aqueducts and the paved roads and the temples with their bright paint, there stands a duller and far more consequential machine, a system for taking a share of what ordinary people produced and moving it into the hands of the state. Somebody, somewhere, had to pay for the stone. Taxation in the ancient world looked very little like the version we know. There were no forms to fill in, no filing season, no letters arriving in the post. Payment came in kinds you could carry. A portion of the harvest handed over at the threshing floor. A fee paid at a city gate before the cart was allowed through. A bolt of finished cloth, a jar of oil, or a stretch of days spent digging a canal for public works. Whole villages could be required to supply labour when the state wanted a road built or a fleet crewed. And the collectors were not shy about asking. Egypt built its system directly onto the rhythm of the river, which is one reason it endured so astonishingly long. Each year the Nile rose and spread across the floodplain, and when the water drew back it left behind a layer of dark silt that renewed the fields without anyone having to do a thing about it. Farmers went out into that soft ground to sow wheat and barley, and behind them, at a respectful distance, came the men with the writing kits. These were the scribes, among the most important people in the kingdom, and among the very few who could read. They carried reed pens, pallets of black and red ink, rolls of papyrus, and knotted cords for stepping out the boundaries of a field. Their work was arithmetic in the service of the crown. The height of the flood had been recorded at gauges built into the riverbanks, and from that single figure the administration could estimate, before one ear of grain had ripened, what sort of year it was going to be. A generous flood meant rich soil and a good harvest, and therefore a larger assessment. A poor flood meant less of everything. The grain went into granaries, and the granaries were the true treasury of Egypt. Great complexes of domed mud brick storehouses, filled through openings in the top and emptied through hatches below, with clerks counting sacks at the door. That grain paid the workmen who cut and hauled stone for the royal projects, fed the priests who kept the temples running, and supplied the army on campaign. In a society that went without coined money for most of its history, grain was not merely food. It was the wage, the tax, and the currency all at once, and a man's income could be quoted in sacks of it. The system had a harder edge, and the Egyptians did not hide it. They painted it on tomb walls. The records describe collectors arriving with an escort, inspecting the fields, and calling defaulters to account when the amount delivered fell short of the amount written down. A farmer thought to be holding grain back could be fined or punished. It was not a gentle arrangement, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But the same machinery had another face. Because the state gathered and stored so much, it could also give back. When the flood failed and the fields came up thin, those granaries could be opened and the grain redistributed to carry people through a bad year. That balance, between taking enough to fund the crown and leaving enough to keep the country standing, is more or less the entire art of ancient government, and Egypt managed it with interruptions for a remarkable stretch of centuries. Rome's problem was different and considerably messier. Rome, at the height of its power, governed an enormous and uneven territory reaching from the damp hills of Britain to the deserts of the eastern frontier. Tens of millions of people speaking dozens of languages, and it had to pay for roads, harbours, aqueducts, garrisons, and the wages of Egypt was one river valley with one harvest cycle and one language of administration. Standing armies spread across the whole of it. So the Romans taxed a great many things. There was a tax on land, assessed on its value or on what it produced, which in the grain-growing provinces of Egypt and North Africa could still be collected as actual grain and shipped across the sea to feed the capital. There was a head tax in the provinces. There were customs duties gathered at ports, at bridges, at the gates of towns and at the boundaries of tax districts, a small percentage of whatever a cart or a ship happened to be carrying, so that a bale of cloth travelling far might be politely taxed several times on one journey. Collection was often farmed out to private contractors, who bid for the right to gather a province's revenue and kept whatever they could squeeze above their bid. An arrangement that made a handful of men enormously rich and the tax collector one of the least loved figures in the ancient. There was a levy on inheritances, and another paid when an enslaved person was granted their freedom, Mediterranean. And then there is the tax everybody remembers. In the 1st century of the Common Era, the Emperor Vespasian, who had inherited an empty treasury and possessed a famously practical turn of mind, revived a levy on a substance collected from the public latrines. This sounds odd until you know what it was for. The fullers, the tradesmen who cleaned and finished cloth, gathered it in jars set out at street corners, because the ammonia in it did the work that detergent does now, and the tanners wanted it as well. It was, in other words, an industrial raw material with a market price, and Rome taxed raw materials. It is said that when his son objected to the business as beneath the dignity of the office, Vespasian held up a coin from the first payment and asked whether it seemed any different from the rest of the treasury. The phrase that came out of that exchange, that money does not smell, has outlived the tax by 2,000 years, and it sums up Roman fiscal thinking neatly. If a thing had value, it could probably be taxed. Provincial taxation was where the resentment tended to gather. Some provinces prospered under it, enjoying the roads and harbours and the long stretches of peace that came with them. Others experienced it only as extraction by strangers. When the demands grew heavy, the temperature rose quickly, and more than one serious revolt in Roman history began as a quarrel about money rather than about liberty. Far away, and much later, on the other side of an ocean the Romans never knew existed, the rulers of the Aztec state built something different again. Their economy did not run principally on coin. Wealth moved as goods and as labour, and the empire that grew out of the lake cities of central Mexico rarely governed conquered towns directly. It left the local lords in place and required them to deliver tribute on a fixed schedule. Officials kept painted registers setting out exactly what each province owed and how often. And those lists make wonderful reading. Loads of woven cotton cloth, warriors' costumes and shields, jade and turquoise, bundles of brilliant feathers, honey, maize, and cacao beans by the sackful. The cacao is the detail worth holding on to, because those beans were not only a luxury to be ground and drunk, they passed from hand to hand in the marketplace as small change, a countable, portable, widely agreed unit of value, which is very nearly a definition of money itself. Different rivers, different gods, different centuries, and underneath all of it the same principle. A state endures for exactly as long as it can keep filling its stores, and not one season longer. Which raises the question sitting patiently beneath all this careful accounting, and it is where the story goes next, what value actually is, and how human beings ever came to agree on it at all. Tribute could arrive in almost any form a province was able to grow, weave, or gather, and one of the most memorable of all was cacao. In the world of the Mexica, the people we usually remember today as the Aztecs, cacao beans were treated as something close to treasure. They were roasted and ground and whisked into a dark, bitter, faintly spiced drink that the great households of the capital took very seriously indeed, and at the same time they passed from hand to hand in the markets as ordinary small change. A few beans might buy a fish or a bundle of firewood. There is something quietly charming in a currency you could also drink, in the thought that the same handful of beans might end the day as a payment or as a warm cup. Sacks of them came into Tenochtitlan by canoe, and on the backs of porters walking in long patient files, season after season, and the storehouses of the city swallowed them the way treasuries have always swallowed everything put into them. But cacao was only one line on a very long list. Cotton cloth was asked of the warmer lowlands, because cotton would not thrive everywhere the empire reached, and finished cloth was wealth in its own right, folded and stacked and counted by the bale. Other districts sent the feathers of tropical birds, brilliant greens and turquoise blues that craftsmen worked into headdresses and shields with a delicacy that still astonishes anyone who sees a surviving piece. Some sent jaguar pelts or rubber gathered from lowland trees. Others sent maize and beans by the binful, or bundles of reeds and canes for building, or salt, or honey, or small quantities of gold dust measured out with enormous care. Every province had its own assignment, and those assignments were written down, though written is not quite the right word. Officials recorded them in painted books, the documents we now call codices, in which a picture of a bundle of feathers or a folded cloak sat beside a numeral telling you how many and how often. The most famous survivor is the manuscript known as the Codex Mendoza, and its tribute pages are a genuine pleasure to look at, page after orderly page of little painted goods, province by province, as neat and unsentimental as any modern ledger. Stewards travelled out from the capital to supervise, checking what had been gathered against what had been promised. If a province declined to send what it owed, the consequence was not a strongly worded letter. The army would come back, and that was understood on both sides without anyone needing to say it aloud. All of this sustained a great deal. Tribute supplied the temples and the ceremonies, funded the campaigns that carried the empire further, and kept the court in the style that courts expect. It also did something less tangible. Every delivery was a small annual restatement of who stood where, which is the part of taxation that has very little to do with arithmetic. And it carried a weakness inside it, as such arrangements usually do. Many of the communities under Mexica rule resented what was asked of them, not abstractly but concretely, watching goods they had grown and woven leave their own towns for a city most of them would never see. The resentment did not announce itself. It settled quietly, the way water settles into stone, and it waited. When outside forces later arrived in the region, that long-accumulated grievance turned out to matter enormously, and towns that had spent generations sending cotton and cacao toward the capital proved willing to consider other arrangements. Empires are rarely brought down by a single blow. More often they are held together by a consent that has been thinning for years. Not every tax in the ancient world, though, was paid in grain or metal or beautiful things. In a great many societies, rulers asked for something their people had in far steadier supply. They asked for work. For millions of people across the ancient world, paying what you owed meant showing up. Not a share of the harvest, but a stretch of your own days, your own back and hands, given over to whatever the state had decided to build that year. The most famous example sits in Egypt, and it arrives with a correction attached, because the popular picture is not quite right. The Great Pyramids were not raised by vast crowds of enslaved people driven along under whips, whatever the films suggest. A large part of that workforce appears to have been ordinary farmers fulfilling a labour obligation during the season, when the Nile rose across the fields, and there was, quite simply, nothing agricultural left to do. The flood put the farmland under water for weeks and turned the river into a highway on which enormous stone blocks could be floated almost to the foot of the plateau. So the state gathered its people in the months when they could be spared, housed them, fed them on bread and beer, and set them to quarrying, hauling, levelling and lifting. We are not guessing at this. Archaeologists have uncovered the settlements where those crews lived, with their bakeries and their bread moulds, and the graffiti in which the work gangs gave themselves proud nicknames. There is even a papyrus logbook kept by an official named Mera, who spent his months ferrying fine limestone downriver for the casing of the Great Pyramid, and noted his journeys as calmly as a man keeping a delivery schedule, which is more or less what he was. It reads less like misery, and rather more like a very long, very dusty public works project. Labour, in that world, was a currency you could pay in. Other civilizations arrived at something similar without ever having heard of Egypt. In the Andes, the Inca state ran on a labour obligation usually called the mita, a rotating turn of service that each community owed. Households sent workers for a set period, and those workers built the mountain roads that still cross those ridges, raised temples and fortresses, cut terraces into slopes so steep it seems almost impertinent to farm them at all, and worked the fields set aside for the state and the shrines. Every turn of service was recorded on the quipu, knotted cords whose coloured strings held numbers with real precision. In return, the state filled its warehouses and, in a bad year, opened them. The result was one of the most impressive networks of roads and storehouses in the pre-modern world, built without coinage and without markets of the kind we would recognise. The wealth of that empire was measured in cloth, in maize, in llamas, and above all, in the ordered work of its people. Rome, for all its coins, did much the same when it suited. Provincial communities were expected to keep the roads outside their towns in repair, and to supply carts, animals, and lodging when officials or soldiers came through. Rome liked money and collected a great deal of it, but it never lost the habit of requiring service when service was cheaper. For rulers, the appeal is obvious. A labour tax lets you assemble a workforce of thousands without finding wages for thousands, so that canals, temples, harbours and roads could be paid for out of the population itself. For the people concerned, the experience was rather different. Long days of heavy work under supervision are long days not spent on your own field and your own animals. In a good year, a season of service was an inconvenience, and perhaps even a change of scene. In a bad year, when the harvest had already disappointed, the same obligation could tip a household from difficulty into real hardship. Both things were true at once, which is usually the case with history. And yet out of that arrangement came a startling number of the structures people still travel across the world to look at, paid for not in silver, but in human effort, patiently repeated over a very long time. Whatever the tax happened to be, though, grain in Egypt, tribute in Mesoamerica, coin in the Roman provinces, there was always somebody standing in the middle of it. Somebody had to come and count. On paper, the job of the tax collector was simple and rather dull. Measure the land, assess the crop, record what is owed, gather it in, pass it up the chain. In practice, it placed remarkable power in the hands of people working a long way from any king or governor inclined to check on them. In Egypt, the scribes did the counting. They arrived with their palettes and reed pens and rolls of papyrus. They measured the fields with a stretched cord and estimated the yield to come, and what they wrote down became the truth of the matter. That is the quiet part. Because the scribe controlled the record, the scribe controlled the outcome. An honest one made an honest note. A careless or dishonest one could set the estimate a little high, or record a delivery as short when it had not been, and if the farmer objected, he objected as a man with a memory against a man with a document. The document usually won. Egyptian wisdom literature quietly advises scribes not to lean on the poor, and advice of that kind is generally written down because it is needed. In Rome, the problem became notorious enough to have a name attached to it. During the Republic, the state often did not collect its provincial taxes itself. It auctioned the right to do so. And here is the whole arrangement in a single sentence. Whatever they gathered beyond what they had promised the state was theirs to keep. It is difficult to imagine a system better designed to encourage enthusiasm. Some of the publicani were respectable men running a legitimate and enormously complicated business across the Mediterranean. Others demanded well above the proper rate, lent money at painful interest to communities that could not pay, and took property from those who still could not. Provincial cities loathed them, and Roman writers back in the capital said so too. Cicero, who governed a province himself, wrote with visible discomfort about trying to keep both the provincials and the tax companies tolerably content, and largely failing at either. Under the emperors, much of the collection passed to salaried officials, which helped, though it never quite solved a problem that is really about human nature. Around all of it moved the smaller currents of everyday corruption. A gift here, a favour there, an assessment softened for a man with connections and pressed harder on one without. Rulers understood the dilemma and could never quite escape it. Without collectors, nothing arrived, and the state stopped. With collectors, you handed real power to people whose interests were not always yours, in places you could not see. And if they pushed too hard for too long, the result was the one thing more alarming to a treasury than an empty vault. There has always been a line between a burden people will carry and one they will not, and it is never marked on any map. Cross it, and history tends to repeat the same short sequence. The example most often told took place in Britain in the 1st century of the Common Era. The Iceni, in the east of the province, had been allied with Rome rather than conquered by it, an arrangement of the kind that usually lasted precisely as long as it was convenient. When their king died, Roman officials moved to take what they judged was owed, and according to the ancient accounts, the seizure was carried out with a cruelty that shocked even the Roman writers who recorded it. The queen, Boudica, and her household were treated with deliberate violence and humiliation. What followed was not a protest. She drew several peoples together and led a rising that swept across the south of the province, and for a season came very close to ending Roman rule in Britain altogether. It was put down in the end. The reprisals were harsh, and it is said that the province was governed rather more carefully afterwards. What it demonstrated, permanently, was how quickly a financial demand pressed without judgment could turn into a war. Elsewhere, the resistance was quieter, but no less real. In Egypt, there are records of villagers simply leaving, abandoning their houses and their fields, and disappearing into the marshes or into another district rather than face an assessment they could not meet. Land went out of cultivation, which meant less revenue, which meant heavier demands on those who had stayed, which meant more of them leaving. And in Mesoamerica, as we have seen, the tribute lists that made the capital magnificent were also slowly making enemies of the towns that filled them. Taxes, in the end, have never been only about money. They are the most regular reminder a person receives of who governs them. When the demand is roughly fair, it is accepted as part of ordinary life, grumbled about and paid. When it becomes arbitrary, or is enforced by men who are visibly enriching themselves, it stops being administration and becomes an insult, and insults are remembered far longer than sums. And yet, for all the trouble they caused, taxes are also the reason any of these worlds existed. Without steady revenue, no ruler could hold distant territory, feed an army, or finish anything larger than a house. Roman taxes built the roads that ran for thousands of miles across 3 continents, still traceable today under modern fields and hedgerows. They paid for the aqueducts that carried cool water into the cities, and for the street fountains where a household filled its jars each morning. In Egypt, grain gathered from the fields fed the crews who raised the temples along the Nile. In Mesoamerica, tribute built and provisioned one of the largest and most beautiful cities on earth at that moment, with its causeways and canals and markets. Taxation also bought a kind of insurance. A treasury with something in it could pay soldiers and open the storehouses when the rains failed or the flood came in low. States that shared out well in a bad year bought a loyalty no amount of ceremony could purchase. Too little revenue, and the roads crumble, and the frontier thins. Too much, and the anger gathers in the villages. Almost every civilization in this story spent its existence adjusting that balance, usually without ever naming it. So we end tonight more or less where we began, with ordinary people going about ordinary business. A man in Ostia buying something hot from a marble counter on his way down to the docks. A fuller stirring cloth in his tubs in the early light, thinking about nothing much at all. A Carthaginian captain watching a harbour crowded with masts, knowing exactly what his cargo is worth in 3 languages. A scribe in the Nile Valley writing down a number that will quietly decide a family's year. None of them thought of themselves as history. They thought about the weather and the price of bread and whether the day would go well. And all of it rests on something very simple and very human, the decision to keep count. To remember what was given and what is owed, and to trust that a promise made in one place will still be worth something in another. That is what money is. That is what all those careful marks on clay and papyrus and painted bark were for. The cities rose and fell, the coins were melted down and struck again with new faces, the ledgers were closed and filed and forgotten in the dark, and the world went on quietly the way it always does. Sleep well.